Hello everyone and welcome to Connect with Evie. My name is Evelyn and I'm your source for tips and tricks about every secret nook and cranny in Objectif Lune's flagship product. Today we are going to take a look at using workflow variables inside of your Connect templates. Meaning from the workflow automation module, we are going to send information through the data mapper all the way to the designer template. Now, of course, if you are a print shop mail Connect client, you don't have access to the workflow tool. If this video interests you, however, please contact your salesperson to get some information about how to upgrade to Planet Press or Press Connect, which obviously both have this option. I've loaded the workflow configuration tool to show you first what is the type of information that can be passed to data mapper and then to designer. The first type of information that we can send are local variables. So if I have a local variable called invoice ID, for example, I would be able to pass that. Now, a local variable, as you may know, resets on every process, but is only set for the whole process, meaning a single local variable won't be run for every single one of your records if you have more than one record that may be important. The other information you can pass is the global variable, and global variables are most used for more like constants. So if you have, for example, here a base URL that you use, like your website address, that is different on the dev and production web servers, you could have that. If you have a path for images, for resources, for snippets, or whatever, that would be put in a global variable. A global variable should never be changed by a process because it can be changed by multiple processes at the same time. The other thing that we can pass to the data mapper and then designer are the job informations. As you may be aware, any input task already has predefined job information. So here we have the source file name and the folder. And all of these variables can be changed or updated using the set job info and variable. So here if I have invoice ID, I can give it an invoice ID, which normally would come from data, but it can also come directly from a database, from a script, from an HTTP API. Whatever method you have of obtaining the information is up to you. Now, my example here says invoice ID. That would obviously only be used if you have a single record again. So test images. So for example, if I put a path in %9. So that would be a proper example. So now that we have a couple of variables here set up, we are going to go into the data mapper and show how you can configure the data mapping configuration to use them. The configuration for the automation variables are in two different places depending on the variable you want to use. If you're using job infos, you have access to job info 1 to 9 here. So if I do ABC 1, 2, 3 for job info 9, then I would be able to use that in the following step. If you want to use local and global variables, you're going to need to go in the properties, add a new property, which I'm going to call invoice ID, and change the scope to automation variable. And I can also give it a default value. An important note is that the name of the variable here, invoice ID with capital I and D, must equal exactly the name of the variable inside of the workflow. They must match, and it's case sensitive. The other thing is, let's say you have a local and a global variable that have exactly the same name, this method will prioritize a local variable first and then go to the global variable if the local one does not exist. So local variable has priority, global variable does not if they have the same name. I've added also the base URL, which is a global variable, and I'm going to show you how to add this to extract it into your data model, so it is then, of course, accessible into your designer template. So I'm going to add a field, and when you're not doing an extraction from the data viewer on top, so when you're not clicking on something and clicking on the extract buttons here, the add button turns into the add JavaScript field, and this is exactly what we want. So what I want to do is automation dot variables dot, and then I'll have access to both of them that were defined in my preprocessor. So if I take the invoice ID here and my semicolon so it doesn't complain, then this will extract the invoice ID. I'll just click out, and you can see that I have my default value. Now, the default value set in the preprocessor obviously will be overwritten when this data mapper is run inside of the workflow. So after I've sent it to workflow and I run it for real, then it's going to take that actual value. In the meantime, it just uses the sample one that I put in. I'm going to add another one here, which is JavaScript automation dot variables dot base URL, and that'll be the base URL. And of course, in terms of job infos also, so automation dot job info dot, and then the one that we want, which here is the job info 9. And this will give me the 3 different fields. Of course, I could rename them by coming here, and I know that this is base URL, and I can reuse that directly in my template. And when I create my template, they will be available. 2 last notes before I leave you. The first one is, if you have a lot of data to transfer, or you have a variable number of lines you want to bring in, and you know you're going to have to process them in Designer anyway, one thing that I like to do is to send JSON data, so JSON formatted strings, through this method into Designer, which I can use json.parse on in order to get an object. If this sounds a little bit alien to use because I'm talking about scripting, you can just go on Google and search for JSON data in JavaScript, json.parse, and JSON strings, for example. Learn a little bit on that. It's a pretty good trick, especially if you have data that you want to pass from a web page and then you want to process that. You can do that with a JSON string through the HTTP server input, which gives you XML, blah, blah, blah. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that in the create web content specifically, create web content, normally when you have your process, you would have execute data mapping. And then the create web content actually has a field for the record ID, which by default will take the first result of the execute data mapping. You can change that. If I open it up here and I show you the create web content, you have the option of taking this and putting 0. And when you do record ID 0, create web content does not expect a record set. It will essentially just run the template without any record present. This is useful for static forms, for any web page that you just want to display information. Anything that does not require variable data, you can display using this method. However, because you don't have data mapping, you don't have access to the extraction and the preprocessor and all of that. However, you do have access to the job infos. That automation.jobinfo.jobinfos 9 or 8, 7, 6, whatever, those are directly available in Connect Designer. assuming you do not use a data mapping configuration. So if you have create web content record 0, then you have access directly in Designer to automation.jobinfos.jobinfox as pass-through data inside of your template, useful for IP addresses, emails, base href for your URL, etc., etc., etc. And this is it for today's Connect with Evie. I hope you learned something new today. If you have any questions, comments, something you'd want to hear about, please don't hesitate to comment below. Subscribe if you want to be advised of new videos. Give me a thumbs up if you like it. And as always, see you in a few clicks.